Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, everyone, get ready for another deep dive. Today, we're going back to the 1960s, a decade when, as you probably know, the fight for civil rights was transforming North America.
It's
But
a pivotal time.
yeah, it really was. But did Indigenous communities play a part in this wave of change?
Absolutely.
I'm glad to hear it. That's what we're going to explore today. How Native Americans in the U.S. and
First Nations up in Canada.
right, First Nations in Canada, how they organized and fought for their rights during this incredible decade.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating period, a time when Indigenous communities were pushing back against decades of injustice, really stepping onto the national stage.
So before we get into the specific events and people, could you kind of paint a picture of what life was like for these communities leading up to this time?
Well, you've got to consider the contrast. I mean, Canada was in the middle of this post-World War II economic boom, but Indigenous communities were largely left out. Poverty on reserves was a harsh reality.
So it sounds like, while the rest of the country was celebrating all this progress, there was this underlying tension, this feeling of being left behind.
Oh, absolutely. And then adding to that, you have the passage of the Canadian Bill of Rights in 1961.
Oh, right.
It wasn't perfect by any means, but it really did spark a national conversation about civil liberties and, importantly, Indigenous rights.
So it kind of brought these issues to the forefront.
It was like this wake-up call. Yeah, like, hey, things need to change.
Okay, so we've got economic disparity, and then we've got this growing awareness of rights. What else was happening at that time that might have sort of added fuel to the fire of this activism?
Well, you can't forget about resource extraction.
Yeah.
Oil, gas, minerals, all of it being taken from Indigenous lands.
Right.
And oftentimes without their consent or fair compensation.
Yeah,
It was a recipe for conflict.
that makes a lot of sense. So with all of this going on, with all this tension, some powerful organizations started to emerge. Can you tell me a little bit about the key players in the U.S.?
Well, in the U.S., two groups really took center stage. The National Congress of American Indians.
Or NCAI, for sure.
Yeah, NCAI, and then the National Indian Youth Council,
Or the NIYC.
NIYC.
Right.
And they had very different approaches, which is what makes this period so dynamic.
Interesting. So let's start with the NCAI. What was their strategy?
So the NCAI formed in 1944, and they were actually pretty inspired by the NAACP's legal victories in the U.S. They believed in using the courts, to protect treaty rights and improve conditions on reservations.
So it sounded like a very strategic, calculated approach.
Strategic litigation,
Right.
trying to make change from within the system.
But I imagine the 1950s termination policy must have thrown a wrench in their plans. Wasn't that a policy aimed at dissolving tribal governments?
Oh, it absolutely was. It was the government basically trying to force assimilation by taking away federal recognition from the tribes.
Wow.
But the NCAI, they fought tooth and nail against it.
Right.
And a great example of their resistance was the fish-ins that happened in Washington state.
The Fish-ins. I've never heard of that. What was that all about?
Well, think of it as Indigenous communities reclaiming their treaty-protected fishing rights.
Oh, interesting.
They were actually inspired by the civil rights sit-ins, so they used civil disobedience to highlight the government's broken promises.
So they took a page from the Civil Rights Movement playbook, adapted it. That's pretty amazing. All right, so let's talk about the NIYC now. How did they differ from the NCAI in their approach?
So the NIYC, they were founded in 1961, and it was made up of mostly younger, college-educated Native Americans.
Okay.
They were tired of waiting for change to happen slowly, and they really embraced direct action.
So while the NCAI was working with it within the system, it sounds like the NIYC was ready to shake things up a little bit.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
They wanted to empower Native youth and kind of dismantle this paternalistic Bureau of Indian Affairs.
Interesting.
And they actually popularized the term Native American.
Oh, wow. That's a powerful shift in language. What was the thinking behind that?
It was about reclaiming identity, rejecting that colonial label, Indian, and defining themselves on their own terms, like a statement. We're not who you say we are.
It's amazing how language can be used like that, to take back power, to kind of, reshape the narrative.
Absolutely. This generation, they were rejecting the status quo and demanded to be heard.
Yeah, yeah.
A real turning point.
All right, so we've got these two really powerful forces at work in the U.S. What was happening up in Canada around this time? Was there a similar kind of rise in activism there?
Oh, there was.
Yeah.
And it all kind of came to a head with Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau's infamous 1969 white paper.
Ooh, now that sounds like a story. We'll have to dive into that next time.
So Are you ready to hear about this white paper?
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
Lay it on me. What was it and why was it so controversial?
Okay, so picture this. The Prime Minister of Canada.
Trudeau, right?
Yeah, Trudeau. He proposes this plan to completely get rid of the Indian Act, like abolish it, dismantle the Department of Indian Affairs, and basically assimilate Indigenous people into, mainstream Canadian society.
That's a pretty radical idea, and I'm guessing it wasn't well received.
You got it.
Mm.
Trudeau, he argued that this was like this progressive step towards equality.
Right, right.
But a lot of Indigenous leaders saw it as this complete disregard for their cultures and rights. Like, are you kidding?
Yeah, I can see how that would be a problem.
Yeah, huge disconnect. And so naturally there was pushback, like a lot of it.
I bet. Who were some of the key figures who spoke out against it?
Well, there was this brilliant Cree leader, Harold Cardinal. He just eviscerated the white paper in his book, The Unjust Society. He called it, and I'm quoting here, a thinly disguised program of extermination through assimilation.
Wow, he didn't hold back.
Not at all.
Mm.
And the National Indian Brotherhood, or NIB, they were just as strong in their opposition. They called it cultural genocide and really led this powerful resistance movement.
So it sounds like Indigenous communities in Canada really mobilized against this. What happened? Did it work?
Oh, it absolutely did. The backlash was so huge that Trudeau had to withdraw the white paper in 1971.
That's amazing. It sounds like, the power of people coming together, really speaking out, can make a real difference.
It really can. It showed the government, like, hey, Indigenous communities, we're not going to be silenced. We're not going to just sit back and let this happen.
Right. But I'm guessing the fight for self-governance didn't end there.
No, it definitely didn't.
Mm.
It was a big win, a turning point for sure.
Right.
But, all those underlying problems we talked about earlier, the economic disparity,
Yeah.
it just got worse, especially with all that resource development happening in the 60s.
So basically, Indigenous communities were watching their land get exploited while they continued to struggle.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And yeah, the Canadian Bill of Rights was there, but there was still this gap between legal rights and what was actually happening. It's like, okay, we have rights on paper.
But what about in reality?
Exactly. Where's the real change? So
Yeah.
they were demanding more than just words.
Yeah.
They wanted real action.
So they were getting more proactive, less reactive.
Right. They wanted control over resource development, a real seat at the table.
So not just reacting to what the government decides, but actually being part of the decision-making process.
Exactly. And this whole idea, of demanding consent and control, it was happening in the U.S. too, especially with the American Indian Movement, or AIM.
Oh, yeah, AIM. I've heard of them. Weren't they a little more, how do I put this, hands-on?
They were. Founded in '68, right in the heart of the civil rights era, and they became known for their more militant tactics.
Okay, like what kind of tactics? What made them different?
Think direct action, protests, occupations. They even started monitoring police brutality in Native communities.
Mm-hmm.
They were really shining this light on the injustices and demanding immediate changes.
So they were more on the front lines.
Oh, absolutely. They were challenging the systems that were failing Indigenous communities.
Got it. So their impact was mostly in the U.S.
Mainly. But their message resonated up in Canada, too, especially after the whole white paper thing. Like, it added fuel to the fire.
So there was some cross-border inspiration going on?
For sure. They were learning from each other, supporting each other, and pushing each other to be bolder.
So we've got strategic litigation, protests, and then this more direct action approach. Sounds like the movement was really picking up steam.
It was. The 60s was this period of huge change. It really laid the groundwork for the Indigenous rights movement we see today.
Okay, so we've got all these players, all this energy, all these different approaches. How do historians even begin to make sense of it all? Like, are there different schools of thought when it comes to interpreting this period of activism?
There are. Historians have looked at it through a few different lenses.
Well, give me a crash course. What are some of the main schools of thought?
Okay, well, first you've got the Indigenous school. They focus on the importance of these organizations like NCAI, NIYC, AIM, NIB. They see them as like the foundation, for Indigenous sovereignty.
So they're focused on the leadership and legacy of these early activists.
Exactly. Then there's the revisionist school. They see those more militant tactics of the 60s, especially with AIM, as, completely justified.
So they're saying that the more intense tactics were necessary given the lack of progress.
Right. And then you've got the progressive school. They focus on the socioeconomic factors behind all of it, like the poverty, the lack of opportunity.
So for them, it's about understanding the root causes of all this activism.
Yeah. And then finally, you've got the consensus school. They see all of this as part of this bigger trend towards expanding democratic values in both the U.S. and Canada.
So they're looking at it through the lens of progress, seeing these demands for Indigenous rights as a natural evolution.
Exactly. They argue that Indigenous people were just demanding the same rights and freedoms as everyone else.
That's interesting. So we have all these different perspectives, but one thing they all seem to agree on is that the 1960s was this really pivotal decade.
It was. It brought these issues to the forefront. It showed what was possible. And it continues to inspire activism even today.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. But before we wrap things up, I think we need to talk about the impact of all this activism, like what actually changed because of it. What were the lasting effects? Because, yeah, you're right. We can't overlook the, the legacy of this era. So what were some of the lasting impacts? What actually changed as a result of all this activism in the 60s?
Well, think of the 60s as like planting a seed.
Okay.
The activism of that decade, it really sprouted into some major legal victories later on. Like we're talking land claim settlements, greater recognition of treaty rights, and even like a change in how governments approached Indigenous issues.
So even though the challenges were far from over, was there like a sense of hope? Did communities start to see things moving in a positive direction?
Oh, there was definitely hope. The 60s showed that Indigenous communities wouldn't be ignored. It proved that, hey, collective action could actually force governments to listen, to negotiate, to make concessions.
Yeah, it's inspiring to hear how, these communities refuse to be silenced. But I know the struggle for self-determination is, well, it's far from over, right?
Right. It's a process.
Yeah.
Yeah, there have been some big strides since the 60s, for sure.
Yeah.
But a lot of those same challenges, they still exist. Poverty, lack of access to, like, basic services, clean water, healthcare, and then there's still all these disputes over land and resources.
So the fight continues, but what about the relationship between Indigenous communities and governments? Did that change at all because of what happened in the 60s?
It definitely changed things. Like the 60s really forced governments to acknowledge Indigenous rights.
Right.
And, to have more meaningful dialogue. It wasn't about assimilation anymore. It was about recognizing self-governance.
Wow, that's a big shift from forced assimilation to recognizing self-governance. What a testament to these movements. But zooming out, what are some of the big lessons we can learn from this era? What can we take away from, all the struggles and the triumphs of this period?
I think the biggest lesson is persistence.
Yeah.
Like, fighting for justice, it's rarely easy and it's not quick. It takes sustained effort, strategic planning, and the willingness to adapt as things change.
Yeah, it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And another key lesson is solidarity. The Indigenous rights movement, it really gained strength from all these different communities working together across tribal lines, even across borders.
So it's really about that idea of strength in numbers, like collective action, achieving what individuals can't do on their own.
Totally.
As we deal with, all the challenges in the 21st century, what else can we learn from the activism of the 60s?
Well, I think it teaches us to really understand history. The struggles faced by Indigenous communities in the 60s, they didn't just appear out of nowhere.
Right.
It was centuries of colonialism, oppression, broken promises. By learning from the past, I think we can understand the present better and work towards a more just future.
It's like you said earlier, it's a process.
Yeah.
We have to stay engaged.
Keep learning.
Keep pushing for change.
Exactly. And the legacy of the 60s, it reminds us that, hey, we all have a role to play in making a better world.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive.
Yeah.
We've explored, the strategies, the challenges, the victories, and the lasting impact of Indigenous activism in the 1960s. We've seen how these communities fought for their rights, from those fish-ins in Washington state to the white paper controversy in Canada, from the legal battles of the NCAI to the direct action of AIM. It's been quite a journey.
It has. It's been an honor to, revisit this era and learn from the courage and determination of everyone who came before us.
And to you, our listener, we hope this deep dive has inspired you to, maybe learn more about the ongoing struggle for Indigenous rights and how you can be a part of building a more just and equitable future.
Yeah. Keep learning, stay engaged, and never stop fighting for that better world.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.